Hello, everyone. My name is Michaela Lighton, and for my PSA project, I decided to focus on sex trafficking. So today I have a PowerPoint for you on that topic. So, sex trafficking, raising awareness and saving lives. So, what is sex trafficking? Sex trafficking is a form of human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation. It is a form of modern day slavery in which individuals perform commercial sex through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. So essentially, victims of sex trafficking are people who are perform commercial sex acts or things like that um, against their will. The hidden nature of sex trafficking. Sex trafficking often happens in plain sight. This is why it is so dangerous, and a lot of people get into situations like this, and they are become victims of sex trafficking. It happens in a lot of domestic settings. And there's also not just abductions for sex trafficking victims. A lot of victims are manipulated into by their trafficker and into becoming part of sex trafficking and becoming a victim. And actually, statistically, there is more people who do it through manipulation rather than abductions. Victims may stay silent due to manipulation or fear. Um, they may not want anything coming back on them in case they do decide to speak up, so they just tend not to speak up about anything. And then victims often don't look distressed. In many cases, victims are told not to give anything away if they are in a public setting or anything like that. So it is kind of hard to pick out someone that is being sex trafficked due to a look of distress because that is not often what is portrayed in society. So, who is affected by sex trafficking? All genders are affected by sex trafficking. However, statistically, women and girls are more likely to be victims of sex trafficking. As of 2022, women take up 90% of sex trafficking victims, girls taking up about 20% or 28% of that 90%. So, as you can see on this graph over here, um, you can see how significant and these numbers are for women that have been sex trafficked, and how big of a portion of victims are women or young girls. In some cases, men are more sex trafficked, but in a majority of these cases, women tend to take the brunt. So, some gender systems and ideologies at play that go into sex trafficking. So, in the United States, there's a lot of hypersexualization of women. So, they are seen more as sex objects and more so used for sexual acts, like I said. Um, there's also a male dominated economic system. This kind of puts men in a position to profit off of women. So, this also allows for more sex trafficking in the United States. And there's also victim blaming culture, which causes people who do decide to speak up about being sex trafficked or claim that they have been or anything like that. It causes them to kind of be disregarded or like seen as not serious or emotional or things like that. And it kind of prohibits a lot of people from speaking out. For global gender systems and ideologies, there in a lot of countries there are patriarchal norms. So these kind of put men at the top of the food chain, and so they kind of are able to get women into these situations where they are involved in sex trafficking and they become victims of sex trafficking. And then there's also a preference in many countries for male children. So this causes girls to be more vulnerable to be taken into sex trafficking because they are viewed as less valuable. And this really causes girls to be at a disadvantage to be sort of protected from sex trafficking. And then there's also cultural commodifications of women. So in some countries, women's virginities are put at a price or they're of like very high value. So, and then they also have dowries for women when they get married, and then the husband will take the money from their dowry and everything like that. And so they're essentially women are used as like monetized bargaining pieces in a lot of countries, and this also puts sex trafficking into that realm because it is very similar to that as well. So the evolution of sex trafficking. So in the past, it was framed as a moral issue. Trafficked women were criminalized and labeled as prostitutes. Feminist movements became split. Radical feminists viewed all sex work as exploitation, I guess you could say. Sorry, I can't say that word. And then sex positive feminists, they defended consensual sex work but opposed sex trafficking. So they are all for being body positive and sex positive about what women want to do for their own kind of work, but they did not view non-consensual sex work to be a positive thing or to be normalized. There's also little attention to the structural causes of sex trafficking. So there was not a lot of focus on how poverty and gender equality kind of led to an increase in sex trafficking and things like that. And then in present day, sex trafficking is recognized as organized crime and human rights abuse. Survivors' voices are being used to create awareness. A lot of survivors kind of create initiatives or movements to help bring awareness to the issue of sex trafficking. Um, there's also a lot of focus on prevention and warning signs. A lot of people are educated in either school or online, things like that. There's a lot of focus on the prevention and warning signs of sex trafficking, so we can essentially stop sex trafficking before it can even happen. Um, we are also recognizing that men, LGBTQ plus members, and children are also victims of sex trafficking. As I mentioned before, sometimes men are in the bigger population for sex trafficking victims in certain regions and countries. So we're starting to recognize that instead of focusing on mainly women being the victims of sex trafficking. There's also an emphasis on online trafficking because we are so immersed in online sites and things like that. It has become very easy for traffickers to kind of find potential victims and be able to manipulate them in so many ways. So there are strategies of resistance and accommodation for sex trafficking. So a few resistance strategies are grassroots organizations and survivor-led movements. There are legal frameworks like the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or the TVPA, and the Palermo Protocol. There's also education and awareness campaigns like the Blue Campaign. For accommodation strategies, in a lot of countries, government corruption and neglect is pretty constant. And so this can lead to inadequate protections for women and sex trafficking victims. And this can kind of lead to a lot of cases just slipping through the cracks. There's also a lot of cultural complicity. So there are stigmas that cause victims to kind of stay silent. Along with the silence for that, a lot of victims fear that they may get backlash or something bad may happen to them if they decide to speak out. And there's also normalization. And so this causes sex trafficking to be viewed as not as big of a deal as it would be in certain countries. So it's kind of seen as normal, quote unquote. And also some anti-trafficking efforts criminalize trafficking victims. So while also punishing those who did the crime and put these women into sex trafficking, trafficking victims in certain laws and policies are seen as prostitutes, and that is also criminalized in certain areas. So that also essentially degrades the victims and criminalizes them in the eyes of the public. So for some cross-cultural cases for instance, in Thailand, it is a huge trafficking hotspot because there's a lot of tourism and a lot of poverty, and victims often come from rural communities lured by promises of work or education. This seems to be a common thing throughout a lot of countries, and like in Nigeria, women are trafficked and for forced prostitution. Their exploitation is linked to debt bondage and cultural beliefs of juju. Victims are often recruited by acquaintances or family members, so it's kind of a little bit easier in Nigeria to find potential trafficking victims. And in the United States, as I said before, technology is a huge catalyst to trafficking because it makes things a lot easier for traffickers to find victims and manipulate them. There's also a lot of trafficking through gangs and pimps in the United States. It's very prevalent in a lot of cities. And in the United States, there's also foster care, homelessness, and LGBTQ status that leads to a lot of vulnerability for sex trafficking because it becomes easy, like I said before, for these kind of cases to slip between the cracks because there's not a lot of support around these people, I guess I would say. And then in India, there is child marriages, which could almost be a way of sex trafficking because you have a child being almost sold off or given to a man for many different reasons. And then there's also domestic servitude, which is very similar. It almost kind of blurs the line a little bit for sex trafficking because it is normalized for servants, so to speak, to kind of do what they were bought for, I guess you could say. And then there's also a lot of normalized sex work in India. So the line also blurs with that on whether this sex work is consensual and it is not forced. So it kind of blurs the lines between sex trafficking and actual like consensual sex work. And so how you can help. So you can learn and share, you can educate yourself and others on trafficking signs and just be on the lookout for any signs that you may see. And to go along with that, you can always report these signs or any suspicious activity. And you want to know how to contact local authorities or national helplines in case you do see someone being trafficked and they need to get out of that situation. You can also support survivors. You can donate or volunteer to NGOs that rescue and rehabilitate trafficking victims and just show a little extra support to help rescue and rehabilitate more victims throughout time, I suppose. And you can also advocate for change. You can help push for better laws, improve law enforcement, and challenge stigmas and harmful norms in your community to kind of break out of that mindset that some people may have that sex trafficking isn't as serious as it looks, or not every case may be considered sex trafficking, things like that, and to just help victims feel more supported within their own communities as well. And you can also make ethical choices. So do not support businesses linked to exploitation and support fair trade and organizations committed to ethical labor. Just you want to make sure that you are supporting the right organizations and businesses and not leading to more exploitation or unethical labor in the world. So some resources and organizations I have compiled for this PSA. There are global anti-trafficking organizations. So you have Polaris, which is based out of the US. You have the International Justice Mission, Anti-Slavery International, based in the UK. And then you have the Blue Heart Campaign, which is mentioned earlier, which helps educate the public about sex trafficking and the warning signs and basically all around, like all encasing sex trafficking as a whole. And then there are also education and reporting resources. So there's a National Human Trafficking Hotline based in the US. There's a Human Trafficking Hotline Directory. And you can also look at TED Talks or survivor blogs and documentaries to kind of learn more on a personal level about sex trafficking and hear the stories from the survivors and the victims of sex trafficking and understand how it impacts people personally. Together, we can end sex trafficking. Be the reason someone is free tomorrow. So thank you for listening to my PSA, and thank you.